Both Miller and Armstrong appear to be putting a lot of focus on one issue in particular early in their campaigns: Second Amendment rights.
But why is that an important issue on the state level? Justin Gick explains.
Political analyst Dr. Mark Springer says there are a couple reasons why both Republican gubernatorial candidates are focusing on this issue. First, he says, the candidate has to get the matter out there right away, basically get it off the table.
Getting ahead of that, I think, is important for them and their campaign managers to say, look, now we've checked that box, so to speak, and we're moving forward with, other issues that might be more important, but that one's still important to them.
Representative Kelly Armstrong says he has always had an A+ rating with the Second Amendment. He says it is never too early to focus on these rights.
North Dakota is, gun country. We have some of the best gun law in the entire country. I was proud when we took Constitution. I was chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee when we passed constitutional carry, and we'll continue to advocate for pro-Second Amendment policy.
Lieutenant Governor Tammy Miller says she is a staunch supporter of the Second Amendment. She said she grew up valuing this issue as it is an important part of who she is. She said in a statement, quote, "As I introduce myself to North Dakotans, talking about the Second Amendment helps share my values, and it's something many can relate to. North Dakota needs to stand as a beacon of freedom, and we have to protect our rights." Springer says if both candidates were not clear on their stance, either could have pointed the finger at the other. He says he doesn't like to call it checking boxes. However, they have to make sure they are meeting certain criteria, and in North Dakota, that means if they are not protecting Second Amendment rights, they are probably not going to get elected.
That's Justin Gick reporting. Springer says we probably won't see Miller and Armstrong continuing to push this issue going forward, seeing as there's not much difference between them on this topic.